There is a quiet mechanism operating beneath everyday financial decisions that rarely feels immediate, rarely feels urgent, and yet has one of the most consistent long-term effects on outcomes. And that mechanism is opportunity cost, not as an abstract concept, but as a continuous trade-off embedded in nearly every allocation of time, money, and attention. At a surface level, opportunity cost is often explained as what you give up when you choose one option over another. But in daily life, it does not present itself as a clear alternative. It presents itself as a series of small, almost invisible decisions that feel isolated, reasonable, and justified within their own context, which is why it is so easy to overlook. When someone makes a purchase, especially a small one, the evaluation typically stops at whether the item provides immediate value, comfort, or convenience. And if it does, the decision feels complete. But what is not evaluated in that moment is how that same resource could have interacted with time if it had been directed differently. This is where the mathematical layer begins to emerge, because opportunity cost is not measured at the moment of decision, it is measured across time. And time introduces compounding, which means the true cost of a decision is not its price, but the future value of what that price could have become under different conditions. To make this more concrete, consider a simple recurring expense, something small enough to feel insignificant on any given day, and extend it across weeks, months, and years. The total begins to grow. But even that total is not the full picture, because the relevant comparison is not just accumulation, but potential growth. If those same resources were consistently redirected into an environment where they could compound, even at modest rates, the difference between the two paths begins to widen over time, not because of any single decision, but because of repetition interacting with time. This widening gap is what defines opportunity cost at a structural level. It is not the loss of money, but the loss of trajectory, where one path maintains the present while the other gradually builds capacity for the future. What makes this difficult to perceive is that both paths feel similar in the short term, because the immediate experience of spending versus redirecting a small amount does not produce a noticeable difference in daily life, which means the feedback loop that would normally guide behavior is delayed. Human decision-making, however, is highly sensitive to immediate feedback and relatively insensitive to delayed outcomes, which creates a mismatch between how opportunity cost operates and how it is perceived, allowing patterns that reduce long-term capacity to persist without resistance. Over time, these patterns form a baseline, a default structure where resources are consistently allocated in ways that prioritize present continuity over future expansion. And once that baseline is established, it becomes increasingly difficult to imagine alternatives because the system feels stable. From a mathematical perspective, this is where the distinction between linear and exponential thinking becomes critical, because most daily decisions are evaluated linearly, as isolated events, while opportunity cost accumulates exponentially, as a function of repetition and time. This difference in scaling is what creates the illusion that small decisions do not matter, because their immediate impact appears negligible, while their long-term effect grows in a way that is not intuitively visible without stepping back and observing the system as a whole. If you extend this logic beyond money into time itself, the same structure appears, because time, like money, can be allocated in ways that either maintain current position or build future capacity, and each small decision about how time is used carries its own form of opportunity cost. For example, time spent on activities that provide immediate satisfaction but do not contribute to long-term development has a different trajectory than time spent on activities that compound in value, even if both feel equally justified in the moment. When these decisions are repeated consistently, the divergence between paths becomes significant, not because of any single choice, but because of the accumulated direction those choices create over extended periods. At a systemic level, this explains why two individuals with similar starting points can experience very different outcomes over time, not necessarily due to large strategic differences, but due to the cumulative effect of small, repeated allocations that either align with long-term growth or remain confined to short-term continuity. There is also a psychological dimension to this, because once a certain pattern of allocation becomes normalized, it no longer feels like a decision, it feels like a default, and defaults are rarely questioned unless something disrupts them, which further reinforces the existing trajectory. This normalization reduces the perceived cost of repeating the same behavior, even when that behavior carries a significant opportunity cost over time, because the absence of immediate consequence makes the trade-off less visible. From a broader economic perspective, systems that reduce friction in spending and consumption tend to increase the frequency of small decisions, which amplifies the role of opportunity cost at the individual level, even as each decision feels less significant on its own. Historically, periods of increased accessibility and convenience have often coincided with higher levels of distributed consumption, not through large expenditures, but through consistent low-level spending that accumulates across populations. This pattern highlights an important principle, that opportunity cost is not just an individual concept, but a systemic one, influenced by the environment in which decisions are made, and the easier it is to allocate resources toward immediate use, the more difficult it becomes to preserve them for future growth. Understanding this does not require eliminating all forms of immediate consumption, but it does require recognizing that every allocation carries a direction, and that direction, when repeated, becomes a trajectory that shapes long-term outcomes. As awareness of this structure increases, behavior begins to shift, not through restriction, but through recalibration, where decisions are evaluated not only by their immediate value, but by their role in the broader system of time and compounding. This recalibration introduces a form of intentionality, where even small decisions are aligned with a larger direction, allowing the system to gradually move toward expansion rather than remaining fixed in place. Over time, this shift does not eliminate opportunity cost, because it is an inherent part of decision-making, but it changes how it operates, transforming it from an invisible drain on future capacity into a tool for directing that capacity more effectively. At the identity level, this represents a transition from reacting to immediate circumstances toward designing long-term systems, where the focus is not on optimizing individual decisions in isolation, but on shaping the patterns that those decisions create over time. And as those patterns become more aligned with long-term growth, the effects begin to compound in the opposite direction, where time and consistency start to work together to expand capacity rather than reduce it, gradually widening the range of possible outcomes. In the end, the math behind opportunity cost is not complicated in its structure, but it is powerful in its implications, because it reveals that the true impact of daily decisions is not determined by their size, but by their direction and their repetition over time. And once that perspective is internalized, the system itself begins to change, not through dramatic shifts, but through steady adjustments that alter the trajectory, allowing small decisions to become aligned with long-term outcomes rather than quietly working against them. And as this understanding deepens, another layer begins to emerge, one that extends beyond individual decisions and into the structure of how trade-offs are perceived, because opportunity cost is not only about what is given up, but also about what is never even considered as an option in the first place, which subtly limits the scope of possible outcomes over time. This limitation is not always visible, because it operates at the level of perception rather than calculation, where certain uses of time or money feel natural and others feel distant or unrealistic, not due to actual constraints, but due to repeated patterns that shape expectations about what is possible within the system. Over time, these expectations become self-reinforcing, as behavior continues to align with what feels normal, and what feels normal is defined by past behavior, creating a closed loop where opportunity cost is not only incurred through action, but also through inaction, through paths that are never explored because they fall outside of the established range. From a mathematical standpoint, this can be understood as a narrowing of the decision space, where instead of evaluating a wide range of possible allocations, the system operates within a constrained subset. And while this may simplify decision-making in the short term, it reduces the likelihood of encountering higher-value trajectories over the long term. This is particularly relevant when considering how compounding interacts with early decisions, because the earlier a trajectory is established, the more time it has to expand, and when early allocations are consistently directed toward maintaining the present rather than building the future, the cumulative effect becomes more difficult to reverse later. However, this does not imply that all early decisions must be optimized perfectly, but rather that awareness of direction becomes increasingly valuable as time progresses, because even small adjustments, when applied consistently, can gradually alter the path without requiring abrupt change. As these adjustments accumulate, the system begins to regain degrees of freedom, allowing new options to enter consideration, and with those options comes the ability to reallocate resources in ways that were previously unavailable, which is one of the clearest indicators that opportunity cost is being actively managed rather than passively incurred. At this stage, decision-making becomes less about choosing between isolated alternatives and more about shaping a dynamic system where each choice influences the next set of possibilities, creating a chain of decisions that either expands or contracts future capacity depending on their alignment. This perspective also reframes the role of discipline, not as restriction, but as continuity, where the goal is not to eliminate all low-value decisions, but to ensure that the overall pattern of decisions maintains a consistent direction over time, allowing compounding to work in a favorable way. There is also an important asymmetry to consider, which is that negative opportunity cost can accumulate quickly through repeated small inefficiencies, while positive opportunity cost often requires sustained consistency before its effects become visible, which can create a temporary imbalance where beneficial changes feel less impactful than they actually are. This asymmetry can discourage adjustment if outcomes are evaluated too frequently, because the system may appear unchanged in the short term, even as its underlying trajectory is shifting, which is why long-term perspective is essential when working with compounding systems. From a broader systems view, this dynamic reflects how complex environments evolve over time, where small inputs, when consistently applied, lead to emergent outcomes that are not immediately predictable from any single action, but become clear when viewed across extended time horizons. In practical terms, this means that managing opportunity cost effectively is less about making perfect decisions and more about maintaining a structure where resources are consistently directed toward paths that have the potential to expand capacity, even if that expansion is not immediately visible. As this structure stabilizes, the system begins to exhibit a form of momentum, where aligned decisions reinforce each other, making it easier to continue in the same direction, and this momentum reduces the effort required to maintain progress, because the system itself supports the behavior rather than resisting it. Eventually, what emerges is a shift in how value is interpreted, where short-term satisfaction and long-term potential are no longer in constant conflict, but are integrated within a system that allocates resources in a way that balances both, allowing for present functionality without sacrificing future growth. And in that integrated state, opportunity cost no longer operates as an unseen force working against the system, but as a visible framework that guides decision-making, ensuring that each allocation contributes not only to immediate needs, but also to the broader trajectory over time. And as this framework becomes more internalized, the relationship between choice and consequence begins to feel less abstract and more continuous, because instead of viewing decisions as isolated events, they are understood as part of an ongoing sequence, where each allocation subtly adjusts the direction of the system, even when the adjustment is too small to notice in the moment. This continuity introduces a different way of thinking about progress, one that is less dependent on visible milestones and more focused on directional consistency, where the emphasis shifts from achieving immediate results to maintaining alignment over time, and this shift reduces the tendency to overreact to short-term fluctuations that do not meaningfully alter the trajectory. At this stage, opportunity cost becomes less about comparison between options and more about calibration of flow, where the question is no longer simply, what am I giving up, but rather, how does this decision influence the path I am already on, which reframes decision-making as a process of refinement rather than selection. This refinement process is gradual and often subtle because it operates within the existing structure rather than replacing it entirely, allowing adjustments to be made without disrupting stability, which is important because systems that are forced to change too quickly often revert back to previous patterns due to lack of structural support. Over time, as refinement continues, the system begins to exhibit a higher level of coherence, where different areas of allocation, spending, saving, investing, and time usage start to align with one another, reducing internal friction and making it easier to sustain consistent behavior across contexts. This coherence is what allows compounding to operate more efficiently, because resources are no longer being redirected in conflicting ways, and instead move in a unified direction, amplifying their collective effect over longer periods. There is also a stabilizing effect that emerges from this alignment, where variability in one area is less likely to disrupt the entire system because other parts of the structure provide balance, creating a more resilient configuration that can adapt without losing direction. In this sense, opportunity cost is not just a measure of trade-off, but a mechanism of alignment, guiding how resources are distributed across time in a way that either fragments or integrates the system depending on how consistently it is managed. As this understanding deepens further, the focus shifts away from individual decisions entirely and toward pattern recognition, where the goal becomes identifying recurring structures within behavior and adjusting those structures at their source, rather than attempting to optimize each instance separately. This approach is more efficient because patterns, once changed, influence many future decisions simultaneously, allowing a single adjustment to propagate across the system, reducing the need for constant intervention at the individual level. From a mathematical perspective, this is similar to modifying the parameters of a function rather than adjusting each output independently, because by changing the underlying structure, the resulting outcomes naturally begin to shift without requiring continuous correction. In practical terms, this means that the long-term impact of opportunity cost is most effectively managed by altering the rules that guide allocation, rather than focusing exclusively on the outcomes those rules produce, which allows the system to evolve organically over time. As these rules become more aligned with long-term direction, the system begins to generate results that reflect that alignment, not through isolated successes, but through consistent reinforcement of the same trajectory, which gradually compounds into meaningful change. And at this point, the role of effort begins to change as well, because instead of being applied to overcome inefficiencies, it is applied to maintain structure, which is a fundamentally different use of energy, one that supports sustainability rather than correction. Eventually, the distinction between short-term and long-term thinking begins to dissolve, because both are integrated within a system that accounts for immediate needs while preserving future capacity, allowing decisions to serve multiple time horizons simultaneously without conflict. And in that integrated state, the math behind opportunity cost becomes less about calculating losses and more about understanding direction, because once direction is aligned, the system naturally begins to produce outcomes that reflect that alignment, making progress not only possible, but structurally supported over time.